It is a little after 11 at night in Tampa, Florida, and inside U.S. Central Command's headquarters, officers are watching real-time footage of precision munitions striking targets thousands of miles away in Iran. This is not hypothetical. This has happened repeatedly over the past several months, most recently confirmed by CENTCOM itself in a string of public releases describing consecutive nights of strikes against Iranian military sites. To understand where things stand today, you have to understand that what looks like a single dramatic headline is actually the latest chapter in a ceasefire that has been quietly falling apart since the week it was signed. Let's go back to where this all began, because the roots of this crisis explain almost everything happening right now. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated campaign against Iran, striking nearly 900 targets in roughly 12 hours. That initial wave killed Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with dozens of senior officials and military commanders. It also killed around 170 people when a missile struck a girls' school next to a naval base near Bandar Abbas, a civilian casualty figure that has been reported by multiple outlets covering the opening days of the war. Within days, Iran had lost its top political and religious authority, and a leadership vacuum opened at the worst possible moment for a country suddenly at war with two of the most capable militaries on Earth. Iran's response was immediate and far-reaching. Missile and drone strikes hit Israel, U.S. bases across the region, and American-allied Gulf states. Iran also moved to close the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important oil transit corridors in the world, triggering a global economic shock that rippled through energy markets for weeks. This is the moment the war stopped being a two-country conflict and became a regional crisis touching Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, and beyond. U.S. and Israeli warplanes systematically worked through Iran's air defenses and military infrastructure in the days that followed. And by early March, Iran had a new supreme leader. Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the man killed in the opening strikes, elevated to the role on March 8th, according to Iran's own state announcements, and independently confirmed by international outlets tracking the succession. By early April, both sides were exhausted enough and the economic and human cost high enough that a ceasefire became possible. On April 8, 2026, the United States and Iran agreed to a 2-week ceasefire brokered by Pakistan. Iran had initially rejected a longer 45-day framework proposed by Islamabad and instead pushed its own 10-point peace proposal. What emerged was a much shorter, shakier arrangement, one that even at the moment of signing, observers warned was built on unresolved disagreements, particularly over the Strait of Hormuz. The agreement stated only that Iran needed to use its best efforts to allow safe passage of commercial vessels, without charge, for 60 days. It said nothing about what would happen after that window, and Iran quickly interpreted the ambiguity as room to eventually impose fees or exert control over shipping through the strait. On April 21st, President Trump extended the ceasefire indefinitely, but indefinite turned out to mean something very different from stable. Barely more than a week after the framework was signed, Iran launched a drone strike against a commercial vessel in the Strait of Hormuz. The United States treated it as a direct violation. This set a pattern that would repeat itself almost mechanically for months. Iran conducts an attack on shipping or on a U.S. aligned target. The United States responds with retaliatory strikes inside Iran, and Iran then retaliates against American allies in the Gulf, typically Bahrain or Kuwait. Each cycle chipped away a little more at the idea that this was really a ceasefire at all. By May, the cycle had escalated into open military exchanges despite the supposed truce. On May 7, 2026, the United States conducted a fresh wave of airstrikes on southern Iran and on Tehran itself, hitting military sites in response to what U.S. officials described as Iranian targeting of American warships. This came during what was, on paper, still an active ceasefire period, and it came amid something called Operation Project Freedom, alongside a U.S. naval blockade that had been imposed on Iran roughly 2 weeks earlier. According to Department of Defense estimates, that blockade cost Iran close to $5 billion in lost oil revenue within its first 3 weeks alone, a staggering economic squeeze layered on top of a military one. Iran, for its part, said the American strikes hit civilian areas on Qeshm Island and around Bandar Kamir, and it responded by targeting U.S. military vessels east of the Strait of Hormuz. Large explosions were reported in western Tehran that same night, a reminder that even during a so-called truce, Iran's capital has repeatedly found itself under direct threat. By July, the ceasefire had become almost a formality in name only. CENTCOM's own public releases, official statements, not rumor, not anonymous sourcing, document round after round of American strikes against Iran that month. On July 8th, CENTCOM announced it had completed another round of strikes intended to degrade Iran's ability to attack commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. On July 11th, it announced a third round of strikes that week, again explicitly tied to Iranian attacks on commercial vessels. By July 18th, CENTCOM was describing an 8th consecutive night of strikes. By July 21st, it had become the 11th consecutive night. That is not a single breaking incident. That is a sustained military campaign that has simply continued, night after night. Throughout a period the world has technically been calling a ceasefire. Al Jazeera's coverage from mid-July captures how fragile the situation had become by that point. In the aftermath of one wave of American strikes, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps said it had struck sites linked to the U.S. military in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. CENTCOM, describing its own strikes that triggered the response, said American forces had hit military air defense systems, coastal radar sites, and missile and drone capabilities using fighter aircraft, naval vessels, and, for the first time in this conflict, one-way attack sea drones. This is a level of technological escalation worth sitting with for a moment. Sea-based attack drones being used for the first time signals that both the tools and the intensity of this fight have been evolving, even while diplomats insisted a truce was technically in place. Now to the freshest and most important piece of this story, because this is where the title's core claim about the IRGC and the ceasefire genuinely connects to verified, named reporting. On August 1st, 2026, according to the Critical Threats Project, which tracks Iran-related developments closely, 2 senior IRGC officers spoke to the New York Times and confirmed something significant, that senior Quds Force commanders used the April ceasefire window specifically to coordinate with Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and Iraqi militia commanders. The stated purpose, according to these officers, was to expand the wider conflict and increase the cost of continued U.S. military operations in the region. This is a real name source claim, 2 IRGC officers speaking directly to one of the world's most established newspapers, not an anonymous leak or piece of unverified propaganda. It strongly supports the idea embedded in the title, that the IRGC was not using the ceasefire to stand down, but to regroup, coordinate, and prepare for continued confrontation. Analysts tracking the story suggested the officers' decision to go public with this now was itself strategic, part of an Iranian information effort intended to deter the United States and Israel from following through on reported plans to strike Iranian energy infrastructure directly. That same day, Kuwaiti air defenses intercepted an unspecified number of Iranian drones targeting Kuwait, according to reporting from the region, a reminder that even as this information war played out in the press, the shooting war continued on the ground. Just 2 days before that, on July 30th, an unnamed senior security official told the IRGC-affiliated Tasnim news agency that Iran had prepared a formal attack plan targeting regional energy infrastructure, in direct response to reports that President Trump had ordered new strikes on Iran. It's important to be precise here because this is exactly the kind of claim that needs a clear verification flag. Tasnim is an IRGC-affiliated outlet, meaning this claim comes from Iranian state-linked media and has not been independently confirmed by Western wire services. Fars News Agency, another outlet with IRGC affiliations, repeated the threat and went further, publishing what it described as a list of regional energy facilities that Iranian missiles could reach, including oil fields and infrastructure in Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. Again, this is a threat published through state-linked channels, not a confirmed attack. And it should be understood as psychological and strategic signaling as much as a literal operational plan. Iran issued these threats specifically after Western media reported that the United States and Israel were considering large-scale strikes against Iranian energy infrastructure. So this is very much a tit-for-tat escalation in rhetoric that layered on top of the actual confirmed military exchanges happening on the ground. So where does that leave things as of today? This is where the most current, verified reporting becomes essential, because the picture, as of the past 48 hours, is genuinely revealing. According to CNN's live coverage dated August 10th, 2026, the U.S.-Iran war is now in its 6th month, and President Trump said, in his own words, that the United States is low-keying negotiations with Tehran. Direct talks that had appeared to be moving forward as recently as early August have, according to this reporting, faltered, with a previously agreed ceasefire now described as being in tatters. On the same day, Trump added a new precondition to any future negotiation. He said the United States would require compensation from Iran for what he described as Iran's past actions, before serious talks could resume. Just 1 day earlier, on August 9th, Iran's government indicated it was not currently engaging in talks with the United States at all, according to the same reporting. Layered on top of that diplomatic freeze is a major internal development inside Iran's military and security apparatus. And this is arguably the most important fresh data point tied directly to the IRGC's role in this story. On Monday, August 10th, Iran's Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei reshuffled the country's top military leadership, announcing 6 senior appointments in a single day. According to Iran International's reporting, This formalized a wartime command structure that had, in some cases, been operating for months without formal decrees. Ali Abdullahi was named Chief of Staff of Iran's armed forces. Ahmad Vahidi was formally appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and promoted to Major General. And in a movie multiple analysts flagged as particularly significant, Mohsen Rezaei, a veteran IRGC commander from the Iran-Iraq War era, was named Iran's new national security chief, replacing Mohammad Bagher Zolgadar, who had resigned just over 4 months into the job. Why does this appointment matter so much to the story the headline is telling? According to Sina Azodi, an assistant professor of Middle East politics at George Washington University, speaking to CNN, Rezaei belongs to a faction within the IRGC that believes the only way to extract concessions from the United States is through the continuation of fighting, applying sustained pressure and what Azodi described as a steady dose of pain on President Trump, rather than through negotiation. In other words, according to this named academic analysis, the elevation of Rezaei is being read by regional experts not as a step toward de-escalation, but as a signal that the more hardline, confrontation-favoring wing of the IRGC has gained real institutional power at the exact moment negotiations were breaking down. That is about as close as the verified record gets to confirming the spirit of the headline. The IRGC, structurally and politically, is positioned right now to keep this conflict alive rather than wind it down. Bahrain and Oman deserve a mention here too, since both have repeatedly been drawn into this conflict, despite not being direct combatants. Bahrain, home to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, has sounded warning sirens on multiple occasions since the war began, according to regional reporting from earlier in the conflict, and was named specifically as a target of IRGC retaliation following the mid-July CENTCOM strikes described earlier. Oman, by contrast, has positioned itself more as a would-be mediator than a target, reportedly working on an arrangement with Iran aimed at managing shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, though as Al Jazeera's August 10th reporting makes clear, Tehran has signaled that any Oman-brokered arrangement on its own would not be sufficient to fully reopen the waterway unless the United States separately meets a broader list of Iranian conditions. That detail matters because it shows the strait isn't just a military flashpoint. It has become a central bargaining chip in the wider diplomatic standoff, with Iran using access to one of the world's most important shipping lanes as leverage in a negotiation that, as of this week, isn't really happening at all. It's worth spending a little more time on Mohsen Rezaei specifically, because his background adds important context to why analysts are treating his appointment as such a significant signal. According to Iran International's reporting, Rezaei's roughly 4 decades inside Iran's ruling establishment include serving as commander-in-chief of the IRGC during the brutal Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, a period that included the disputed Karbala 4 offensive. He has also run for Iran's presidency multiple times without success. Perhaps most notably, Rezaei has, for years, been the subject of an Interpol red notice connected to the 1994 AMIA bombing in Buenos Aires, Argentina, a case Argentine prosecutors have long linked to Iran and Hezbollah, though Iran has consistently denied involvement. That a figure with this specific history has now been placed in charge of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, the body that sits at the center of decisions on war and diplomacy with the United States, is precisely why regional analysts describe this appointment as a hardline signal rather than a routine bureaucratic reshuffle. According to al-Bawaba, Pezeshkian described the country's current condition as neither war nor peace, and said that Iran's biggest challenge right now is not the possibility of renewed military conflict, but the economic hardship facing ordinary Iranians. He reportedly emphasized that maintaining national unity would be vital for the country's next phase, arguing that internal cohesion matters more than political divisions, as Tehran tries to balance domestic economic strain with regional security concerns. That juxtaposition is worth sitting with. On the same day Iran's supreme leader elevated a hardline IRGC veteran to the country's top security post, Iran's president was publicly emphasizing economic hardship and unity over confrontation. It suggests a government where military and civilian leadership may not be entirely aligned on how forcefully to continue this conflict, a dynamic that could matter a great deal for how the situation develops from here. It's also worth understanding this conflict against the backdrop of what came immediately before it, because the pattern of ceasefire violations we've been describing is not new to this specific war. It echoes a shorter, earlier round of fighting. In June 2025, in what's now referred to as the 12-Day War, Israel struck Iranian nuclear and military facilities, and the United States conducted its own strikes on Iranian nuclear sites on June 23rd of that year. Iran responded by launching 14 missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, an attack that caused no casualties, and was followed by diplomatic outreach involving Qatar and the United States. President Trump at the time expressed openness to a ceasefire and reportedly thanked Iran for giving advance notice of the strike. According to Wikipedia's tracking of that earlier ceasefire, it held for roughly 8 months despite some initial violations by both Iran and Israel in its first hours, right up until the current war broke out on February 28, 2026. In other words, the region has seen this exact pattern before: an intense, short burst of conflict, a fragile ceasefire that mostly holds, and then a much larger, more destructive war reigniting once the underlying disputes over Iran's nuclear program and regional military reach went unresolved. That history matters because it's part of why so many regional analysts are skeptical that the current ceasefire, even if formally repaired through renewed negotiations, would hold any more durably than the one that came before it. The mediation effort behind April's ceasefire deserves a bit more context as well. Pakistan positioned itself as the primary broker, hosting direct talks in Islamabad that included a U.S. delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance, alongside Middle East Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and President Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, according to contemporaneous reporting from India's national broadcaster. Iran's delegation was led by the Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, a figure who had become central to Tehran's wartime leadership structure following the loss of so many senior officials in the February strikes. Pakistan's Prime Minister, Shehbaz Sharif, personally engaged Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian by phone to help confirm Tehran's participation in the talks. Pezeshkian later stated that the decision to accept the ceasefire had been taken unanimously by Iran's leadership and approved by the supreme leader. Notable, given that Iran was, at that exact moment, still without a permanent, formally confirmed supreme leader following Ali Khamenei's death just weeks earlier. French President Emmanuel Macron also engaged both sides diplomatically during this period, expressing hope that any ceasefire would be respected not just narrowly between Washington and Tehran, but across every front of the broader regional conflict, Lebanon included. It's worth being honest about what the record does not yet confirm. As of this recording, there is no single named dated report of one specific new incident where the IRGC explicitly broke the ceasefire on a particular day this week, triggering a brand new, freshly announced round of American strikes in direct response. What the verified reporting actually shows is arguably more significant than a single incident. It shows a ceasefire that has been eroding continuously and publicly since the week it was signed, confirmed by CENTCOM's own statements describing repeated, sustained strikes through July, confirmed by named IRGC officers describing their own coordination efforts during the truce, and confirmed just 2 days ago by Trump himself describing the ceasefire as effectively over in substance, even if no side has formally declared it dead on paper. Tehran sits at the center of almost every one of these developments, not just symbolically, as Iran's capital, but literally as a repeated target and command center throughout this war. It was near Tehran that explosions were reported during the May strikes. It is in Tehran that Mojtaba Khamenei now governs from the same command structure his father once led, before that structure was decapitated in the February strikes. And it is Tehran's own state-linked media apparatus, Tasnim and Fars, that has been used to broadcast Iran's threats and signal its posture to the outside world throughout this crisis. Whatever comes next in this conflict, Tehran remains the gravitational center of it, the place where military decisions, political appointments, and public messaging all converge. There is also a broader regional cost that's easy to lose sight of amid the back and forth of strikes and statements. According to Wikipedia's tracking of open-source military reporting, cross-referenced with regional defense statements, the United Arab Emirates alone had intercepted and destroyed over 500 ballistic missiles, more than 2,000 drone attacks, and dozens of cruise missiles fired from Iran as of early April using U.S. supplied THAAD and Patriot missile defense systems. Those attacks killed more than a dozen people in the UAE, according to regional reporting, including foreign workers from Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. A reminder that the human cost of this war has fallen disproportionately on migrant laborers with no stake in the underlying conflict. Saudi Arabia has reported its own casualties and infrastructure damage from Iranian strikes, including damage near Al-Kharj and interceptions by Greek-operated Patriot systems deployed in the kingdom. 6 Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Jordan, jointly condemned Iran and its regional proxy forces back in late March, a diplomatic signal that the war had already alienated much of the Gulf well before the ceasefire even existed. Lebanon, too, has remained entangled in this story, even though it is technically a separate front. Iranian officials, including Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, argued earlier in the conflict that Israeli strikes on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon amounted to a violation of the broader ceasefire spirit, even if Lebanon wasn't a direct party to the U.S.-Iran agreement. According to regional reporting from April, Lebanon's health ministry said Israeli strikes on a single day killed over 180 people, the highest single-day toll of that particular front up to that point. French President Emmanuel Macron reportedly pressed both Washington and Tehran to ensure the ceasefire held not just narrowly between the US and Iran, but across all the connected fronts of this wider war, including Lebanon. Beyond the strikes and the diplomacy, there's an economic dimension to this story that helps explain exactly why the Strait of Hormuz keeps showing up as the flashpoint for nearly every ceasefire violation. According to the U.S. Congressional Research Service, roughly 20 million barrels of oil moved through the Strait of Hormuz every single day before this war began, representing close to 27% of all global maritime oil trade. That is an extraordinary concentration of the world's energy supply, funneling through a waterway barely 100 miles long, bordered directly by Iran. When the strait effectively closed following the outbreak of war on February 28th, the International Energy Agency characterized it as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, according to Wikipedia's tracking of IEA statements and contemporaneous economic reporting. Brent crude, the international benchmark, surged past $120 a barrel in the earliest weeks of the conflict, and by late March, industry analysts, including Fareed and Fesharaki of FGE Nexant ECA, were telling Bloomberg that a prolonged near closure of the strait could push prices toward $150 to $200 a barrel if the situation didn't stabilize. The United States and other nations responded by releasing 400 million barrels of oil from strategic reserves, described in CNBC's reporting as the largest release on record, and temporarily lifted certain sanctions on Russian and Iranian oil simply to give global markets breathing room. The human and economic toll of that disruption has extended well beyond the Gulf itself. According to Wikipedia's compiled tracking of the war's economic impact, Vietnam experienced fuel shortages and panic buying as global supply chains strained under the pressure. Research from the Center for Economic Policy Research estimated that even a relatively short one-quarter closure of the strait would raise U.S. headline inflation by 0.6 of a percentage point in 2026, with the Dallas Federal Reserve separately modeling that a strait closure removing close to 20% of global oil supply could lower global real GDP growth by an annualized 9 percentage points in the second quarter alone. Qatar, one of the world's largest exporters of liquefied natural gas, saw parts of its enormous LNG production facilities sustain missile damage that Qatar Energy warned could take up to 5 years to fully repair, according to Bloomberg's ongoing coverage of the conflict's economic fallout. And this is not a crisis that resolved itself once the ceasefire was announced in April. According to the most recent Congressional Research Service update, dated in the first days of August 2026, periodic Iranian attacks against shipping and retaliatory U.S. strikes against Iran have severely disrupted traffic through the strait for most of the past 5 months, essentially the entire lifespan of the supposed ceasefire. That same report notes plainly that the current status quo, meaning ongoing low-grade conflict layered on top of a nominal truce, could persist for as long as both the United States and Iran assess that they can absorb the economic and military costs involved. In other words, according to congressional analysts, this isn't a situation expected to resolve on its own. It is being actively sustained by both sides' calculations about what they can tolerate. Just 2 days ago, on August 10th, Al Jazeera reported that Brent crude was climbing again, up more than 1% in a single trading session, as Tehran's insistence that the strait will not reopen without major concessions from Washington continued to unsettle energy markets. That is the same day, worth noting, that Trump introduced his new compensation precondition and that Khamenei announced the sweeping IRGC-linked military reshuffle, meaning the diplomatic freeze, the military leadership shakeup, and the renewed market anxiety over Hormuz all landed on the exact same news day, reinforcing just how tightly interconnected the military, political, and economic threads of this story have become. So what does this all add up to as of today, August 12th, 2026? A ceasefire signed in April that was, by the U.S. president's own recent description, effectively in tatters within months. A pattern, documented in CENTCOM's own public statements, of sustained American strikes on Iran continuing well past the ceasefire's supposed start, often as direct retaliation for Iranian attacks on shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Verified, named source reporting confirming that senior IRGC officers used the ceasefire period not to stand down, but to coordinate a wider regional network of allied militias. A fresh Iranian military leadership reshuffle just 2 days ago that installed a hardline IRGC veteran known for favoring continued pressure over negotiation into the country's top security role. And a diplomatic track that, as of the most recent reporting, has stalled entirely, with Washington adding new preconditions and Tehran saying it isn't currently talking at all. Whether this specific moment produces a single dramatic new headline-grabbing strike, or whether it simply continues the slow, grinding pattern that has defined the past several months, the underlying reality is the same. This is not a peace that broke suddenly. It is a fragile, contested truce that has been breaking, piece by piece, in full view of the public record, since the week it was signed. Tehran has been at the center of that unraveling from the very beginning, and based on everything confirmed so far, it's likely to remain there. It's worth pausing here to flag exactly what this script is built on and where the uncertainty genuinely lies, because that distinction matters more than ever in a story this fast-moving. The core historical facts, the February 28th strikes, the assassination of Ali Khamenei, the April 8th ceasefire brokered by Pakistan, the naval blockade, and the succession of Mojtaba Khamenei, are drawn from Britannica's ongoing tracking of the conflict alongside multiple wire and broadcast sources, and are not in serious dispute. The confirmed rounds of American strikes through May and July come directly from CENTCOM's own official public releases, which are about as close to a primary source as this kind of story gets. The claim that IRGC officers coordinated with regional proxies during the ceasefire comes from named individuals speaking to the New York Times, as reported through the Critical Threats Project's tracking. The most current diplomatic and military leadership developments, Trump's compensation demand, the low-keying of talks, and the Rezaei appointment, come from CNN's live coverage and Iran International's reporting, both dated within the last 2 to 3 days of this recording. And where this script draws on Tasnim or Far's news agency, that material has been explicitly flagged as Iranian state-linked media reporting Iran's own threats and framing, not independently verified Western reporting, and it should be weighed accordingly. Similarly, casualty and interception figures attributed to national defense ministries, including Saudi Arabia's, the UAE's, and Iran's own, reflect each government's official accounting of strikes on its own territory. And in a handful of cases, particularly early in the war, those figures have been revised or disputed as fuller information emerged. The economic analysis in this script draws on the U.S. Congressional Research Service, the Dallas Federal Reserve, the Center for Economic Policy Research, and Bloomberg's ongoing market coverage, all of which are named checkable institutional sources rather than anonymous estimates. Reasonable people, including named experts cited in this script, currently disagree on where this heads next. Some argue that both Washington and Tehran are simply posturing ahead of an eventual return to serious negotiations, using strikes and hardline appointments as leverage rather than as signals of an intent to permanently abandon diplomacy. Others, including the analysts cited earlier regarding Mohsen Rezaei's rise, argue that the structural balance of power inside Iran has shifted toward factions that see continued, sustained pressure on the United States, not a negotiated settlement, as the more effective long-term strategy. This script has tried to present both threads as they currently stand in the verified record, rather than picking one outcome and presenting it as settled fact. And to be fully transparent, no single, uniquely dated incident matching the exact headline, one specific moment where the IRGC broke the ceasefire and triggered one specific new round of strikes today, could be independently confirmed at the time of this recording. What is confirmed, repeatedly and from multiple independent angles, is that the ceasefire in substance has been failing for months, and that the IRGC's internal posture, as of this week, has moved further toward confrontation rather than away from it. Given everything laid out here, the repeated American strikes that never really stopped, the IRGC's own admitted coordination with regional proxies during the supposed truce, and a fresh leadership shakeup in Tehran that appears to favor continued pressure over a deal, where do you think this actually heads next? Does a real, lasting ceasefire still feel possible to you? Or does the pattern of the last 6 months suggest this war is simply going to keep grinding on in the same on-again, off-again rhythm? Let us know what you think down in the comments. That's where things stand as of today. Thanks for watching, and we'll keep tracking this story as it develops.